Everyone feared the winters in Stone Creek not because of the cold, but because of what came with it. Silas McGraw had once buried the dead here. Now, he feared they'd come knocking again. The snow had piled high, a sea of white stretching across the land, as far as the eye could see. The cabin, once a place of warmth and life, now stood like an old tooth lost in the mouth of a long-forgotten landscape. His heart was a hollow echo of the man he used to be, lost in the days when the world wasn't so cold. That was before everything had fallen apart. He hadn't meant to come back to this place. He had only wanted to fetch a rope of jerky, maybe his father's hunting knife, something to take with him when he left the town behind. But something in the woods had drawn him back, an ache, a feeling not quite fear, not quite instinct, but something that tugged at him. It was the kind of feeling you couldn't explain, like the world was trying to tell you something, and you weren't sure if it was a warning or a whisper from the past. The wind bit at his coat as he stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind him. The hearth was dark, a chill settling over the room, and the bed lay untouched, still and unmoving. The walls smelled of pine and ash. But there was something else, something hollow, something old that had been buried deep within the cabin, locked away for too long. Then, as he set his rifle down by the door, he saw them. 3 small figures huddled by the fireless hearth, wrapped in tattered blankets. There was a girl, a boy, and a younger girl, barely able to sit up on her own. They didn't flinch, didn't stir at his presence. For a long moment, Silas thought they were dead, some cruel trick of the winter's fury. But then the eldest girl opened her eyes. They were pale blue, sharp like ice water, and they locked onto him, unblinking, as if he were the ghost in her world. Silas blinked, his breath fogging the air. What in God's name? His voice was a low rasp, carried more by the confusion in his mind than any real disbelief. The boy stirred, his small, pale form barely visible under the layers of dirty blankets. His hair stuck to his forehead, lips cracked with the cold. He shifted, wrapping a frail arm around the smallest girl, as though trying to shield her from Silas, from this strange man who had stepped into their world. Silas's hand trembled as he set his rifle down, leaning forward as though he could somehow understand what was happening. He didn't ask questions, not yet. Not in a world like this, where questions could break you. Instead, he walked across the room, knelt by the hearth, and poked at the cold ashes, still warm. They must have found kindling somewhere, or stolen coals from another cabin, a fragile fire, already gone. He looked at them again, this time more closely. He could see the ribs of the boy, the faint, ragged tremble of the little girl's breaths. They were hungry, cold, and, perhaps, lost. "You got a name?" he asked the eldest girl, his voice gruff from years of silence. She didn't answer, didn't even blink. Silas sighed, rubbing his jaw. "You all alone." His breath rose in the air as he waited for an answer that didn't come. The smallest one coughed a dry, fragile sound, and he was already on his feet. Without a word, he crossed to the back room, pulling the quilt from his late wife's trunk. The trunk was a box of memories that hadn't been touched in 2 winters, but now it felt necessary, almost urgent. Silas draped it over them, his fingers stiff from long disuse, handling the fabric with the kind of reverence he hadn't allowed himself in years. He didn't ask where their parents were. Out here. When children showed up half-frozen with no adult in sight. You didn't ask questions. You just acted. The snow thickened outside as the day dragged on. And by noon, Silas had worked the stove back to life, muttering under his breath like a man trying to scold the universe for the way it had left him behind. The boy didn't eat at first, just stared into the bowl, but Silas left it there anyway. Wild rice and squirrel stew, still hot, by evening. The bowl was empty, and the fire had warmed the cabin enough to make the shadows seem less threatening. The eldest girl sat cross-legged now, elbows on her knees, watching him as he patched a hole in the roof with a slab of tin and tar. She didn't speak, but her eyes tracked every movement he made. Silas muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. "Don't suppose you're going to tell me where you came from?" he asked. "Nothing. 2 nights," came the boy's voice, a soft, flat tone that didn't carry fear, but suspicion, the way a boy spoke when he'd seen too much of the world already. Silas blinked. "You talked," he muttered, surprised. He looked at the boy, trying to gauge his sincerity, but all he saw in return was a quiet challenge. "Where's your folks?" Silas asked, though he knew the answer would come to him the same way his wife's death had unsaid, untouched. The wind shifted outside, a low moan that sounded like old bones creaking under the weight of time. The boy didn't answer. Silas knew that tone. It was the same one he had used when the doc had asked him what happened to his wife, that wordless wall of grief, final and unmovable. He didn't press any further. Instead, he poured another bowl of stew and left it on the table, sitting in the chair that used to belong to his wife. The chair didn't rock anymore. It hadn't rocked in 2 winters. He stared into the flames like they might give him an answer, like they might somehow change what was inside him. The silence in the cabin seemed to stretch and thicken with every passing moment, until, finally, the eldest girl broke it. She glanced at Silas, her eyes full of suspicion. But there was something else there, too. Something new. "You going to turn us in?" she asked, her voice thin, trembling. Silas looked at her, seeing the way her lip quivered, but no tears fell. There were no tears from any of them. Not yet. He shook his head. "Ain't nobody coming up this far in winter. Besides, if someone did this to you, I reckon they'll freeze before they find you again." Her eyes softened just a little. She didn't speak again. "You got names?" Silas asked, almost as if he were asking about the weather. The eldest girl hesitated. "Ellie," she said, the name dropping from her lips like a stone dropped into water. She gestured toward the boy. "Toby," she said. Then she touched the baby girl's curls, and with that simple action, she gave her name. June. Silas nodded, watching them carefully as the name settled in his mind like seeds planted on snow. "Well," he muttered, "I'm Silas. This here's my cabin. Guess we're roommates." For the first time since he'd met them, Toby smirked a brief, dry thing, but real. Silas stood up, stretched his back, and threw another log onto the fire. The silence outside the cabin crept in through the cracks in the walls. But inside, something new was starting to grow. Not comfort, not yet, but maybe the start of it. He stepped onto the porch that night, alone, and lit a pipe he hadn't touched in months. Snow whispered down like ash from the heavens. There were no stars, just the hollow dark. Silas thought of his wife, of the baby they'd lost before she passed, and of the grave just beyond the fence where no birds came anymore. Then he looked back at the window, where 3 heads were barely visible in the flickering light. He exhaled slowly, the smoke curling upward. "Goddamn ghosts," he muttered. But he wasn't talking about them. He slept on the floor that night, the children taking the bed, and for the first time in 2 winters, the cabin held more breath than just his. The girl June was barely breathing. Silas woke to the sound of nothing, no whimper, no cry, just the faintest whisper coming from the bed, like the wind squeezing through a nail hole. The storm wasn't just wind and snow. It felt like a weight pressing down, trying to crush everything it touched, inside. The fire crackled faintly, and the warmth it offered was more like a reminder of what Silas had lost, a fragile flicker in the vast cold of his life. The cabin, which had stood so silent for years, now felt alive with the sound of breath and the slight rustle of the blankets as the children shifted in their sleep. Yet even as the storm raged, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that something else was out there, something that wasn't just the storm. He sat by the stove, staring into the flames, watching them flicker and bend like the memories of his past. It had been a long time since he had been part of something that mattered, something that wasn't weighed down by grief. His wife, her soft laughter, and the baby they had lost. They felt like distant ghosts now. But the weight of their absence still sat heavy on his chest. It was in moments like this that Silas could almost hear the echoes of their voices. The way she had touched his shoulder before she passed. The way she had smiled at him even on their hardest days. And then, the cold. The unbearable cold that had stolen everything from him. But now, there was something new in the cabin, a weight that wasn't just his own, and it was tied to the children. Ellie stirred in the bed, her eyes cracking open. For a moment. Silas wondered if she was going to ask about the past. Maybe it was just his own thoughts, but he could feel her watching him in the dark, the way she had been watching him since the first night they met, as if she could see through the thick walls of his solitude, trying to piece together the fragments of a man who didn't want to be found. The boy, Toby, lay near the window, his back to the room, hands clasped tightly around something, perhaps the knife he had found, or just the comfort of something solid. June was still asleep, but even in the dim light, Silas could see the way her small chest barely moved. He had wrapped her tightly in the quilts, but the fever still burned through her fragile body. The storm outside had begun to quieten, but Silas could feel the tension in the air. The fire was still low, the shadows long. It was as if the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, a sharp noise broke the silence, the faint sound of a twig snapping outside. It was too subtle to be the wind, and Silas's breath caught in his chest. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle resting by the door, his fingers wrapping around the cold metal, the familiar weight grounding him. The noise came again, closer now. He stepped to the window, careful not to make a sound, and peered out. The snow, thick and undisturbed just hours earlier, was now marred by tracks large, heavy prints that weren't made by the children. His heart quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. There were few things that could make a man's pulse race faster than the sound of someone approaching your home in the middle of a storm. But Silas wasn't the kind of man who was easily rattled. Not anymore. He could hear movement outside. Soft, deliberate. Whoever it was. They were close. Too close. A chill ran down his spine, but he didn't let it show. He turned back to the children, each of them still sleeping, their faces pale beneath the quilts. For a moment, he considered waking them, telling them to get ready, to be ready for anything. But he didn't. Instead, He turned his attention back to the door, his hand tightening around the rifle. The door creaked as it rattled against the wind, the frame groaning like it hadn't been opened in years. He had to make a decision. He could stay hidden, wait, and hope the danger passed, or he could face it head-on. Silas was a man who had always preferred to meet his troubles with a steady hand. He'd lived too long in the dark corners of his own grief, avoiding the things that could hurt him, pretending that if he stayed quiet enough, the world would forget him. But the children, Ellie, Toby, June, they had come into his life, uninvited and fragile, and now they depended on him. And no matter how hard Silas had tried to shut the door on the past, it had crept back in, bringing the storm with it. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, moving quickly toward the door. There was no time to waste. Every instinct told him the storm was just the beginning, and the danger outside wasn't just some fleeting shadow. He had to protect them, and maybe, just maybe, in doing so, he would protect something within himself, something he hadn't realized he still had left to give. He swung the door open, the cold air hitting him like a slap to the face. The storm was fierce now, snow swirling in every direction, but the figure outside was unmistakable. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing still as if waiting for something. He wasn't alone. The silhouette of another person stood behind him, partially obscured by the storm. Not the best weather to be out in. "Friend," Silas said, his voice low but steady, betraying none of the tension building in his chest. The man stepped forward, his boots crunching in the snow. His voice came through the storm, gruff and cold. "We're looking for something. Or someone." Silas didn't move, his grip tightening on the rifle. The man wasn't here to talk. He was here for the children. Silas could see it in the way he was staring, eyes narrowing as they flicked toward the window where the children slept. "Who are you?" Silas asked, his voice like gravel in the cold air. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Gus. Don't suppose you've seen any lost souls passing through these parts. Have you?" The wind picked up again, and for a moment, all Silas could hear was the distant whistle of the storm. The man's gaze never wavered, and Silas could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, but he made no move to fire. He wasn't sure if he needed to yet. "You got business with me?" Silas asked, his voice quieter now. Gus took another step forward, and the other man moved slightly, his silhouette emerging more clearly from behind. Both were armed, rifles strapped to their backs, though neither had yet made a threatening move. "We don't mean any harm," Gus said, though the edge in his tone made it clear that wasn't entirely true. "Just need to ask some questions." Silas didn't reply, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the men in front of him. The storm roared around them, but inside, there was a stillness, a kind of suffocating tension that hung heavy in the air. The house was quiet now, the children still unaware of the danger that had arrived on their doorstep. Silas could feel the weight of their lives on his shoulders, the gravity of the choices he was about to make. "You'll get no answers here," Silas said, his voice low but firm. "Now, you best leave." For a long moment, Gus didn't speak, just stood there, his eyes locked onto Silas. Then, without warning, he took a step back. "We'll be back," Gus muttered. Silas didn't blink, but behind him, something in the cabin creaked, something that hadn't moved in years. The door creaked as Silas shut it, the latch falling into place. Outside, the storm had quieted, but inside, The silence was heavy with a warning that had yet to fully unfold. The morning after the storm, the world outside was still, a vast, untouched expanse of snow that stretched endlessly across the landscape. The air was sharp, biting with the cold. But the sun, pale and weak, hovered low in the sky, casting long shadows over the land, inside the cabin. The warmth of the fire had already begun to fade, leaving behind a lingering chill that was more than just physical. The tension from the night before had settled like dust, heavy and silent. Silas McGraw sat by the stove, his fingers tracing the edge of a worn mug, staring into the flickering flames as though they might offer some kind of answer. The events from the night before, Gus and his mysterious companion, had left a deep unease in his gut. The men hadn't come looking for trouble, not in the way most outlaws did. No, they were here for something else, something that Silas couldn't put his finger on. The feeling that something was off, that the children weren't just running from the past, but from something far worse, had taken root in his mind. The children were still asleep, their quiet breaths filling the room with a softness that seemed to make the space feel almost normal. But Silas knew better. He knew that this fragile peace couldn't last. The knock on the door from the night before had been a warning, one that Silas hadn't fully understood at the time. But now, in the cold light of day, the meaning was clear. The storm had passed, but the real danger was still out there. Ellie was the first to stir, her eyes blinking open slowly. She glanced around the cabin, her gaze landing on Silas with the kind of quiet understanding that only a child who had seen too much could possess. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she sat up slowly, the weight of exhaustion still visible on her face. Her hair was tangled, her clothes worn and weathered, but there was a strength in her eyes now, something more than just the fear of the unknown. Toby stirred next, his small form shifting under the quilts. His movements were more restless than Ellie's, as though he was still trying to figure out what world he had woken up to. He blinked a few times, looking around the room as if he could still feel the shadows of the storm lingering in the corners. June, still weak, remained in the bed, her small body curled up under the quilts, her chest rising and falling with shallow, fragile breaths. Silas couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't going to make it through the next few days unless something changed, but even as the worry tightened in his chest, he refused to let it show, not in front of the children. He couldn't afford to break now. The cabin was still, but outside, the world was changing. The snow had stopped falling, but the air was still thick with the kind of silence that could drive a man mad if he wasn't careful. It was the kind of silence that preceded something bad, something dangerous. Silas could feel it in his bones, in the air, in the way the wind had shifted. The tracks left behind in the snow from the night before were gone now, erased by the fresh layer of white. But the memory of those prints still lingered in his mind. He stood up slowly, moving towards the window and peering out. There was no sign of the men, no trace of the strangers who had come the night before. The world outside seemed empty, untouched, but Silas knew better. They were still out there, waiting. He could almost feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to make a move. He turned back to the children, his eyes lingering on Ellie. She had become the unspoken leader of the group, the one who carried the burden of responsibility for her younger siblings. Silas had seen it in the way she watched him, in the way she kept the others close, always looking out for them, even when she couldn't protect herself. "Ellie," Silas said, his voice low but steady. "You've got to keep close to the others. Stay inside today. Don't go near the windows. Understand?" Ellie didn't argue. She simply nodded, the weight of her silent agreement settling between them like a promise. She knew the dangers just as well as Silas did. Toby, for his part, seemed eager to act, always the one ready to fight or run. But Silas wasn't sure which it would be this time. The boy's instincts were sharp, and that made Silas both grateful and wary. He didn't want Toby to grow up too quickly, but it was clear that the boy was already learning how to survive in a world that offered no guarantees. By the time the day had passed into evening, the storm had long since faded into nothing but a memory, leaving behind only the silence. But the silence was no comfort to Silas. He had spent years in it, years hiding from the world. Now, it felt like it was closing in on him, and he knew, deep down, that the storm wasn't over. It had only been a prelude, a warning of something much worse to come. That evening, as they gathered around the stove, Silas noticed Ellie watching him. Her eyes were sharper now, more focused. She had seen something in him, something he couldn't quite put into words. It was as if she had already figured him out, knew the secrets he had buried deep inside. She simply sat there, watching him with that quiet strength, until the moment Toby whispered. Where's Ellie? Silas turned, the girl was gone. The front door was slightly open, and in the snow outside, only one set of footprints led into the woods. Toby, on the other hand, was restless. His eyes kept darting toward the window, as if expecting someone to come through it at any moment. He had been holding his mother's coat, the one they had taken when they ran. He kept it close to him, as though it were the last piece of his old life. June was quiet, still feverish, but her eyes fluttered open every now and then, and Silas could see the faintest flicker of recognition in them. She was still with them, still holding on. And that was enough for now. As the night deepened, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would test them all. He stood up and moved to the door, his boots creaking softly on the wooden floor as he made his way across the room. There were things he needed to do, things he didn't want to face but knew he had to. He would need to prepare, to fortify the cabin, and make sure they were ready for whatever was out there. He opened the door slowly, the cold air rushing in as he stepped outside. The land before him stretched out, quiet and ominous, the snow reflecting the pale light of the moon. He stood there for a moment, taking it all in. Before he heard it, the soft creak of boots in the snow. He turned his head, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the faint silhouette of a man standing at the edge of the woods, staring toward the cabin. Not again, Silas whispered to himself, his fingers tightening around the rifle he had grabbed from the corner. And in that moment, Silas realized the past hadn't knocked. It had broken down the door. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, a shadow in the snow, watching Silas. And Silas knew, with a cold certainty, that whatever came next would change everything. The sun had barely begun to break over the horizon, casting pale light across the snow-covered wilderness. The cold was bitter, the kind that seemed to seep into your bones and settle there, a constant reminder of how unforgiving the world could be. Silas McGraw stood at the door of the cabin, rifle in hand, watching the figure at the edge of the woods. His breath came in quick, visible bursts, the steam rising into the frigid morning air. The man hadn't moved, hadn't said a word, and Silas found himself wondering if he'd imagined the whole thing. But then the figure took a step forward, just one, and Silas felt the weight of the moment settle heavy on his chest. It had been days since the storm had passed, and the land had returned to its quiet. Still self. The tracks in the snow had disappeared, but the unease Silas felt had only grown. Gus and his companion had come and gone, their words lingering in the air like a threat unspoken. And now, this man, standing just beyond the tree line, watching Silas like he was the one who was out of place. Silas' grip on the rifle tightened, his knuckles turning white. The man was tall, his outlines stark against the pale backdrop of the wilderness. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden by the brim of a weathered hat. But even from this distance, Silas could see the gleam of metal on his hip, another gun, another man who had come to bring trouble. He didn't move at first, just stood there, like he was waiting for Silas to make the next move. Silas didn't flinch, didn't speak. The wind whispered around him, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for him to decide. He had a rifle, a broken past, and the lives of 3 children depending on him. He couldn't afford to make mistakes now. The man shifted his weight, his boots crunching in the snow, the sound crisp and sharp. He stepped forward again, this time closer, and Silas could feel his pulse quicken. He didn't recognize this man, and yet something in the way he moved, the way he carried himself, made Silas uneasy. This wasn't just some wanderer or lost soul. This man had purpose. "Who are you?" Silas called out. His voice steady but low, carrying over the snow like a quiet warning. The man stopped, his hands lifting slowly, palms facing outward in a gesture that was meant to be calming, but felt anything but. Silas's finger hovered over the trigger, ready for whatever came next. "Name's Boone," the man said, his voice rough, like he'd been chewing on gravel for years. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Silas didn't lower the rifle. "Then what the hell are you doing here?" His voice cracked slightly, the tension breaking through. Boone's eyes flickered to the cabin behind Silas. And for the first time, he took a step back, his gaze narrowing. "Looking for someone," he said. His voice quieter now, almost apologetic. "Ain't no harm in that, is there?" Silas' gut twisted. The same words Gus had used, the same unsettling undertone. No harm. Boone wasn't here for peace. He was here for something else, something that made Silas's skin crawl. He tightened his grip on the rifle, just enough to steady his aim. "You've got no business here," Silas said, his words hard and final. "Now turn around and leave." Boone didn't move for a moment, just stared at Silas, his expression unreadable. The wind kicked up again, swirling the snow around them in thick gusts. Silas could feel the cold creeping into his bones, but he stood firm, waiting for the man to make his next move. Finally. Boone sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly in what might have been resignation. "Maybe you don't know who I am," he said, his tone a little softer now. "But I reckon it's best you do." Silas didn't flinch, but he could feel the unease crawl up his spine. He'd spent too many years in this world, surrounded by men who said one thing and meant another, to be fooled by a man's soft words. "I don't need to know who you are," Silas said coldly. "I just need you to leave." The man's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, but more a twisted line of understanding. "Guess that's not gonna happen." Then, Boone said, without warning. He moved, faster than Silas had anticipated, his hand darting toward his gun. Silas reacted instinctively, the rifle lifting in a blur of motion. He wasn't quick enough, but he was steady. The first shot rang out, loud and sharp, splitting the cold air between them. The bullet missed, but only by inches. Boone had already ducked, rolling to the side, his own gun now out and aimed at Silas. The world around them exploded into noise, the crack of the gun, the howl of the wind, the sharp sound of boots scraping through the snow. But Silas didn't waver. He'd been in enough fights to know that panic didn't win wars. Calm, precision, those were the things that kept a man alive. He steadied himself, bringing the rifle up again, just as Boone was rising to take another shot. This time, Silas didn't hesitate. The rifle kicked in his hands, and Boone's gunshot was drowned by the sharp crack of Silas's shot. The sound of metal striking flesh echoed in the silence. Boone dropped to the snow, his body falling heavy and lifeless into the cold earth, the snow already beginning to settle around him, as though the land itself was trying to swallow him whole. Silas stood there for a long moment, rifle still raised, breath coming hard and fast, eyes locked on the fallen man. He didn't move, didn't lower the rifle. His heart pounded in his chest. But the silence that followed felt even more deafening than the gunshot. Inside the cabin, the children remained unaware of the danger that had just passed. But Silas could feel it, the weight of what he had just done. The guilt, the adrenaline, the certainty that something was wrong. Boone hadn't come alone. He hadn't come for just a conversation. This was the beginning of something worse, something Silas couldn't yet name. He slowly lowered the rifle, his fingers shaking now, though he wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from the remnants of the violence he'd just had to commit. The figure in the snow was still, and Silas knew it wouldn't be the last time he saw men like that. Not in this part of the world. The wind picked up again, swirling around him like it always did. It was colder now, biting through the skin. But Silas didn't move toward the cabin. He couldn't. Not yet. He had to be sure. And in the distance, far off where the trees met the horizon, another figure appeared, another shadow against the snow. Silas' heart skipped a beat. The storm was coming again, and it wasn't going to pass this time. Another man, silhouetted in the distance, moving closer, his outline shifting with the wind. Silas didn't need to see his face to know he wasn't alone. The night was thick with a biting cold that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Silas McGraw stood in the doorway of the cabin, rifle in hand, staring out into the darkness. The wind howled, a mournful wail that seemed to echo the emptiness that had crept into his soul over the years. The figure he had seen earlier, another shadow moving across the snow, was gone, swallowed by the night. But Silas could still feel his presence lingering like a bad omen. He could hear the soft crunch of boots in the snow, the eerie silence broken only by the occasional gust of wind. Whoever was out there wasn't far, and they weren't alone. He had spent too many years on this land, too many winters alone, to be fooled by the quiet. The world wasn't silent when it was about to take something from you. It waited. It bided its time. Silas knew better than to ignore the chill creeping up his spine. That man, whoever he was, hadn't come alone. No one traveled this far out in the wilderness unless they were looking for something, or someone. He turned back into the cabin, the warm light of the fire offering a fleeting comfort against the encroaching cold. Ellie and Toby were sitting by the stove, their eyes wide with worry. But they didn't ask questions. They were used to this by now. June was still in the bed, wrapped tightly in quilts, her fever burning through her small body despite the warmth Silas had tried to provide. Silas felt the weight of their trust on his shoulders. He had promised to keep them safe. But how could he do that when the storm was only beginning to pick up again? The storm outside wasn't just the wind and the snow. It was a storm of their own making, a reckoning that had been waiting for him ever since the children had arrived at his doorstep, bringing with them a history too heavy to be left behind. "You can't stay here forever," he muttered to himself as he moved to the window, peering out once again. The night was still, too still. A blanket of white covered everything in sight, and the only movement was the wind whipping the snow into the air. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet that made it feel like the world had stopped. But Silas knew better. The storm would come again, and this time. It wouldn't be a man out in the distance. It would be something much worse. Ellie stood, her hand on Toby's shoulder, her eyes following Silas's every move. She didn't speak, but the question was clear in her gaze. She had already figured out what Silas hadn't said aloud. The storm wasn't over. "Who's out there?" Ellie asked softly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. Silas didn't answer at first. Instead, he moved across the room, grabbing his coat from the hook by the door. "You stay here," he said, his voice low, like the words were heavy on his tongue. "I need to check something. Stay inside. Keep June warm." Ellie didn't protest, though the tightness in her jaw betrayed the concern she felt. She nodded once, turning her attention back to Toby, who was clutching a small knife in his hand, his eyes wide with fear. He wasn't a child anymore. He was learning to survive in a world that had already stolen too much from him. Silas stepped outside into the cold, his boots crunching in the snow as he made his way toward the edge of the woods. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, sickly light across the barren landscape. The snow beneath his feet was untouched, save for the occasional set of tracks, some fresh, some older, leading out into the trees. Whoever was out there had been here before. They were circling. The wind cut through him. But Silas didn't stop. He kept moving, one step at a time, his rifle held tight in his hands. He knew this land. He knew how to move through it without being seen, and he had no intention of being found. Not this time. Not when there were children depending on him. As he reached the tree line, he paused, listening. The wind carried with it the faintest rustling sound, footsteps, distant but steady. And then, in the silence, the unmistakable crack of a twig. Someone was close. Silas crouched low, his body blending into the shadows of the trees. He wasn't sure how many there were, but he knew enough to trust his instincts. This wasn't just a scouting party. They were coming for the children. The figure emerged from the darkness, his face barely visible beneath the brim of his hat. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and moving with the kind of purpose that told Silas everything he needed to know. He wasn't alone. There were others. He could feel them, just beyond the edge of the trees. Silas stayed low, waiting for the man to come closer. He could hear the soft crunch of boots in the snow, the man's breath coming in quick bursts, his movements deliberate, like he was searching for something. Silas felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the world would finally come to claim what it had lost. Without warning. The man stepped into the clearing, and Silas saw him clearly for the first time. The man was older than he had expected, his face weathered and scarred, his eyes sharp and cold. He was alone. But Silas knew that wouldn't last for long. The man stopped, his gaze sweeping the area around him, though he didn't seem to notice Silas crouched in the shadows. The wind howled again, and the man shuddered, pulling his coat tighter around him. Silas took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the rifle. He had to act fast. "You've been looking for something," Silas called out from the darkness, his voice carrying over the wind. The man froze, his eyes darting toward the sound of the voice. "Who's there?" the man called, his hand going instinctively to the gun at his side. Silas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his boots crunching in the snow, the sound sharp in the stillness. "You've been looking for the wrong thing." The man's eyes narrowed, and Silas could see the recognition flicker in them. He knew who Silas was. He had seen this man before, in the shadows, in the distance. But Silas had no intention of making this a conversation. He wasn't here to trade words. He was here to protect. The man's hand moved to his gun, but Silas was faster. With a quick motion, he raised his rifle and aimed, his finger tightening on the trigger. The man froze, his hand hovering over the handle of his weapon. "This is your last warning," Silas said, his voice steady but firm. "Leave now, and you won't regret it." For a moment, the man didn't move, didn't speak. It was as if they were both suspended in time. Two men standing on opposite sides of a battle neither had started, but both had been forced into. And then, the silence was broken. The sound of horses' hooves echoed through the trees, coming closer, faster. The man's eyes widened in realization, and Silas knew that he wasn't just facing one enemy anymore. This was the beginning of something far worse. The first shadow appeared through the trees, followed by another, and another. Silas could hear the men on horseback, their presence undeniable. The hunt had begun, and this time, there would be no turning back. The moon hung high, casting an eerie glow over the snow-covered wilderness. The wind had died down, but the air was still sharp, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made everything feel brittle. Silas McGraw stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle steady in his hands, eyes scanning the shadows. The sound of hooves in the distance was growing louder, the clatter of metal and the thud of horses' hooves against the frozen earth echoing through the night. He knew they were coming. He had known from the moment the first figure had stepped into the clearing. The men on horseback weren't just looking for trouble. They were looking for a fight. The world around him felt both too quiet and too loud. A strange paradox that tugged at his nerves. He had come to this place to escape, to bury his past, and forget the world he used to know. But that world had found him again. The children, their innocent faces, had drawn the kind of attention Silas hadn't wanted, couldn't afford. And now, he was facing the consequences. The first shadow appeared through the trees, tall and hulking, moving through the snow with a slow, deliberate pace. Silas' grip tightened on the rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the soft sound of the horses' hooves, their presence growing closer with each passing second. Another man emerged, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. Silas didn't need to see his face to know what kind of man he was. These were the kind of men who didn't ask questions, who didn't care about right or wrong. They only cared about what they could take. And they were here to take. The horses' hooves grew louder, the riders now within clear sight. 3 of them, their silhouettes cutting through the night like ghosts, their faces hard and unreadable. Silas' breath caught in his throat as he watched them approach, each of them armed, their eyes scanning the clearing for signs of movement. "Is this where it all ends?" Silas muttered to himself, the words feeling more like a confession than a question. The past had finally caught up to him, and there was no running from it now. He knew what they were here for. But he wasn't about to give it up without a fight. He had already lost too much. He wasn't going to lose the children. Ellie, Toby, and June were still inside the cabin, oblivious to the danger lurking just outside. Silas could hear the faint sound of their voices, Ellie talking softly to Toby, trying to comfort him, trying to keep him calm. Silas' heart ached at the thought of what they might face if the men found their way inside. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. The first rider came into full view, his face pale and grim, his eyes locked onto Silas like a hawk tracking its prey. Silas didn't flinch, didn't move. He stood his ground, rifle raised, waiting for the right moment. "You're a hard man to find," the rider called out, his voice rough and cold, carrying through the night air. "But we've been looking for you, McGraw, and it looks like you're gonna make us work for it." Silas didn't respond. He didn't have to. The rifle in his hands was all the answer the man needed. He wasn't going to let them take the children, not without a fight. The second rider moved into view, his horse's hooves crunching in the snow as he approached, his eyes cold and calculating. He was taller, broader than the first man, his face scarred, a cruel grin spreading across his lips. "You've made a mistake, McGraw," the second rider said, his tone low, menacing. "You think you can just hide out here with these kids and pretend nothing's going to happen? You're wrong." The third rider came into view, just as the second one finished speaking, his horse kicking up snow as he approached. He was the oldest of the three, his face lined with years of hard living, his eyes dark with something that Silas couldn't quite place anger. Greed. Maybe both. "Time to pay the price," the third rider said, his voice grating, like gravel being ground underfoot. For a moment, Silas didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching them, waiting. He could hear their horses' breath, see the way they circled, like wolves sizing up their prey. Silas wasn't sure how many of them were out there, how many more were lurking in the shadows, waiting for the signal to pounce. He knew one thing for sure: they weren't going to just walk away. The wind picked up again, biting at his skin, as Silas took a deep breath. He'd made a promise to protect the children, no matter the cost, and he wasn't going to break that promise now. With a sharp movement, Silas swung the rifle up, his finger pressing gently on the trigger. The first shot rang out, sharp and clear in the cold night air. The rider closest to him jerked back, a grunt of pain escaping his lips as he fell from his horse, his body crumpling into the snow. For a moment, everything stood still. The wind, the snow, even the men on horseback. It was as if the world had held its breath, waiting for what came next. The second rider immediately pulled his own rifle from his back, raising it to take aim at Silas. But Silas was faster. He had already moved, ducking behind the trees, his rifle ready for the next shot. The second rider's bullet missed, grazing the edge of Silas' coat. But it was enough to get him moving. The third rider, who had been waiting in the back, spurred his horse forward, his eyes wild with anger. He wasn't going to wait for Silas to make the next move. He was coming in, fast and hard, hoping to end it quickly. Silas had other plans. He aimed quickly, the rifle steady in his hands, and fired once more. The third rider's horse reared back, the rider's body falling to the ground with a sickening thud. For a moment, it looked like the battle might be over, but Silas knew better. There was still one left, the second rider, still standing, his face twisted in rage, raised his rifle again, his eyes locked on Silas. He was determined. But Silas wasn't finished yet. He had one chance, one shot. With a steady hand, Silas aimed once more. The second rider took a step forward, and that was all it took. The rifle cracked again, and the rider fell, his body hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Silas stood there, the echo of the final shot still ringing in the air, as the world around him settled into silence. He could hear his own breathing, ragged and uneven, the weight of what he had just done pressing down on him. But the battle wasn't over. The storm had only just begun. He turned back toward the cabin, his heart pounding in his chest. The children were still inside, and now they were the ones in danger. Silas heard the faint sound of movement behind him, a soft shuffle in the snow. A figure rising from the ground. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. And so, the winter's breath continued to blow across the land, as unforgiving as ever. But something had shifted in the stillness of that old cabin at the edge of Stone Creek. The wind that howled through the pines seemed softer now, like it carried with it the whispers of past lives. The ones who had walked these lands long before Silas McGraw had ever come to hide away in the shadows of his grief. The quiet, the kind of silence that fills a room after the storm has passed, was different now. It wasn't filled with the weight of death, or of fear, or of regrets that could never be undone. No. It had become something else entirely, a kind of fragile peace. The sort that blooms quietly like wildflowers after a long, bitter frost. The kind of peace you can only find after a battle fought not with guns, but with the spirit one that endures even when everything around it falls apart. For Silas, standing alone in the doorway as the snow began to settle over the land, he could feel it, the long, aching truth he'd buried deep inside, one he'd forgotten existed until now. His life had always been about survival, about living just to get by, but standing there, watching the cold wind sweep the world clean. He knew something had changed. The children had changed him, as children do, in ways he never saw coming. They reminded him of the strength that lies in tenderness, in humanity, in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. And though he had once thought he had buried honor beneath the weight of loss, he now knew that it can never truly be erased. It waits, patiently, for the right moment to rise again, like an old oak standing firm in a storm, its roots dug deep in the earth. Ellie, Toby, and June, those names. Like a song sung too softly to be heard, but too important to be forgotten, had shown him the truth he thought he'd lost. Justice, the kind that was born from a quiet act of love, may come late, but it is no less powerful for the wait. A woman once forgotten, lost to the wind, could still rise up and show the world a kindness that had long since vanished. She had saved them all in ways that no one would ever know, but she had done it with her heart, not with words. The truth doesn't always need to be shouted from the rooftops. Sometimes, it only needs one person to carry it with them, silent, unwavering, and steadfast in their belief that doing the right thing matters. And though the world may never recognize the sacrifices made, the stories told in the shadows of winter, they still echo in the places where the wind never stops. Silas had learned that the hard way, but in the end, it was enough to know that. When everything else fades away, kindness and love still have the power to make the world just a little less cold. As the cabin settled back into its quiet rhythm, with the fire crackling softly in the hearth, Silas stood there, one hand resting on the old door frame, watching the twilight steal across the sky. The world would always have its storms, its battles, and its ghosts. But as long as the children remained safe, as long as the cabin stood, there would be something worth fighting for, in the distance. The sound of a horse's hooves echoed faintly in the valley, a reminder, perhaps, that no matter how far the journey takes you, you can always find your way home. It was a good thing to remember, especially when the world seemed too big, too wild, to ever find your place in it, and for those who still believed, who still held on to the idea that justice, honor, and love were worth fighting for. Let this tale be your reminder. If you've ever stood in the shadow of a mistake, or felt the weight of a life lived in silence, know that you're not alone. The wind may howl, and the nights may grow long, but there's always a new day waiting. And if you still believe in kindness, in standing up for what's right, in letting the world know you won't give up on it, then leave a sign, leave a mark. If you want to hear more of the tales that whisper through the pines, press that #1 key and let your voice be heard, because there's always more to the story, always more tales waiting to be told. So, gather round, friends, and listen closely. The road ahead is still long, but for those who choose to walk it, there's something worth the journey. And the next story is already waiting, just a flicker of hope in the dying embers of the fire, ready to rise again with the dawn.